This is U.S. History Lecture 3.7 on current history. This is the end of our History 2 class. I know that comes with much consternation on your part. You'll miss these lectures. Okay, we have two presidencies that cover this final period, and this is really almost current event stuff. We can just kind of think about this, and if any of us pay attention to the news at all, not that I suspect many of us do, we can kind of keep adding to this as events develop. But we have Bush, and you see I differentiate in Bush 43 as opposed to Bush 41. We talked about Bush 41 at the beginning of the 90s. Bush 43 reversed George George Walker Bush. And we'll break it into foreign policy and domestic policy as we have before. And we'll do the same thing with Obama, break it into foreign policy and domestic policy, and go from there. And you see here on this slide, we just basically have the highlights. Bush's foreign policy was dominated by the aftermath of 9/11. His domestic policy was highlighted by two recessions that he faced. The first in 2001, which was a fairly minor recession, but was a forewarning of the Great Recession, is what they've been calling it, the banking crisis that really began at the end of 2007 and 2008 and came to full fruition in 2009. And what we're going to see is this with both Obama and Bush, we're going to see a continuation of this trend of Keynesian economics. And in point of fact, there really is, in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of monetary policy, there's very little distinction between Bush 43 and Obama. Obama's foreign policy has been characterized by the continuation of the war with the fundamentalists, and especially since the third term of Vladimir Putin, which began in 2012, and the ascendancy of Xi Jinping as president of China in December of 2012, January 2013, we see an increasing amount of foreign policy attention paid to the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. And then in domestic policy, as I said, this has been a continuation of Keynesianism, and I guess the defining feature of the Obama administration has been the ACA, which is actually the full form of it. It's known as Obamacare. The full form of it is Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which is probably the least appropriately named law in the history of the United States, because there is absolutely not a single provision whatsoever in the ACA that in any way assures that it's going to be affordable. Okay. We're going to try to avoid as best we can tangents, because this is all fairly current event stuff. A lot of it falls in the field of American foreign policy and macroeconomics and a whole slew of other things that if I were to allow myself to bring them all in, this would go on for days. And so we're going to try to truncate it down and just get to the highlights. Okay, so first we have the attacks on the World Trade Centers on 9/11. In the rapid aftermath of those, the Bush administration will go to the United Nations immediately and seek the UN Security Council's endorsement for getting rid of the government of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban rise to power in Afghanistan in 96. We talked about that during the 1990s. And they will almost immediately form an alliance with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda itself, we're not going to get into too much. We would if this were international relations or if it were American foreign policy. But Al-Qaeda is an umbrella organization. It's currently under the control or under the command of a guy by the name of Zawahiri, who is an Egyptian. Prior to that, of course, it was Osama bin Laden. And it's beyond our scope to really discuss at great lengths Al-Qaeda itself, but it is an umbrella organization. Their command structure is decentralized, okay? And so the Bush administration is going to seek permission, or is going to seek endorsement from the United Nations, which they will get. And then in a Clinton-esque type of move, the United States will manage to kind of continue the redefinition of NATO and use NATO as the main force in the invasion of Afghanistan and the later occupation of Afghanistan. Of course, the United States will lead the charge from 2001 to 2003. Then from 2003, really until 2009, the U.S. takes a backseat to the British and French in the occupation of Afghanistan. And then after 2009, the U.S. will take the lead again. Shortly after the ouster of the Taliban government, the United States will implement, is probably the best, fairest way to say it, the Karzai government. Now, the Karzai government is a popularly elected Afghan government, at least on the surface. But what we have to understand, and this will be true of Iraq as well, is that the Afghan election process that brought Karzai, and now the current president Ghani, to the presidency were very carefully controlled by the United States. What we mean by that is that the United States vetted all candidates, which means the United States decided who could and who could not run for office. And anyone that even remotely had a connection either to the Taliban or to any organization the United States deemed a terrorist organization was not permitted to participate in the elections. Now, if this were international relations, we'd go into this at some length, because this creates a significant difficulty. Because what you're going to end up with is a large percentage of Afghans who will feel themselves politically disenfranchised because the candidates that they're allowed to choose from are not the candidates who represent their interests. Okay, and this will immediately segue into an insurgency that is ongoing. You don't hear much about it in the news anymore. Okay, the war in Afghanistan when the United States invasion of Afghanistan and the later occupation and insurgency is really the forgotten war, because it's the longest war in U.S. history. It starts in October of 2001. And from 2001 to 2003, the Western media covered it at some length. But then when the United States invaded Iraq, all attention kind of went to Iraq, and Afghanistan just got forgotten about. And there's a number of reasons for that. Okay, the insurgency itself has ebbed and flowed in terms of its virulence, and we'll get into that a little bit more. The problem with the insurgency, you see down here at the end of this slide, I say Guantanamo Bay and international law. The invasion of Afghanistan created the detention center at Guantanamo Bay. Prior to that, it wasn't used as a detention center. When it does so, it creates a very fine point in international law. And it's been a difficulty, and we'll highlight it here, because it's a difficulty the United States has dealt with throughout what I guess I would loosely refer to as the war with the fundamentalists. Under international law, you have two choices. You can either prosecute someone under domestic law, under civil law, okay? Or you can prosecute them under international law and the Geneva Convention that governs prisoners of war, okay? If you're going to detain someone under international law and under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you either have to categorize them as a civil criminal or a prisoner of war. The folks that have been detained in Guantanamo Bay have not been designated as either. They are not governed under civil law in the United States, neither are they governed under international law as prisoners of war. And so as a result, they exist in this purgatory nether region. Okay? This actually is a violation of both human rights and international law and the United Nations Charter. I mean, technically speaking, George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Don Rumsfeld who were the actual overall commanders of this, could be charged with war crimes as a result of establishing this, which is one of the reasons that the Obama administration wanted to sort this out. Now, the fact of the matter is the Obama administration hasn't sorted anything out. They've left Guantanamo Bay more or less exactly as it is when they took over. The second invasion, of course, that the Bush administration will undertake is the invasion of Iraq, known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. Okay? Like Afghanistan, the Bush administration will go to the United Nations. However, the United States presents a series of arguments. The Bush administration presents a series of arguments to the United Nations Security Council to try to get the UN Security Council to endorse a U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and the overthrow of the Ba'athist government therein. The first argument they tried to make was that there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. This was blatantly false. There was no evidence whatsoever to connect the two together, and in point of fact, the al-Qaeda leadership despised Saddam Hussein because Saddam Hussein was a secular Arab leader, okay, meaning that he wasn't a fundamentalist Muslim, which they saw as compromising the integrity of Islam itself. What al-Qaeda wants is a fundamentalist regime. They want a fundamentalist era, meaning that they want Sharia, Islamic law, to be the same as to be the governing principles of civil code. Hussein didn't do that. In fact, Saddam Hussein made it. He was the most secular of all the Arab leaders. In fact, he made it possible for a woman to sue their husband in court and receive up to 50% of their property. Okay, this is unheard of in Islam. Now the second, and so that case fell apart immediately. The second case the United States tried to press was that Iraq was in violation of UN sanctions governing the prohibition of the development of chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, so-called weapons of mass destruction, WMD. Okay, and so the Bush administration is going to simultaneously try to make the case both to the American people and to the United Nations, and they'll send Colin Powell, then U.S. Secretary of State and kind of war hero, to the UN to do it. Now, as part of the negotiated process, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the IAEA, is allowed into Iraq, and what the IAEA reports back to the United Nations Security Council is that there is insufficient evidence to support the contention that the Ba'athist government has been working towards the development of nuclear weapons. In fact, what they find is evidence that the nuclear weapons program was abandoned in the mid-90s, as was the chemical weapons program. Okay? Now, because of this, Russia and China especially make it very clear to the United States that should a resolution come up to the United Nations Security Council requesting the sanctioning of force against Iraq to overthrow the Ba'athist government, that they would vote no, and as permanent members of the Security Council, this then would be a veto, and so it's pointless to put forth such a resolution. France made a similar argument, but not pressed as strongly, and theirs was based not only on the lack of evidence supporting the U.S. position, but also because the French were concerned that the overthrow of the Ba'athist government would unleash forces in Iraq that would be, under the best circumstances, difficult to control. This works out to be fairly prophetic, given the last 12 years in Iraq. And so the Security Council decision is that there's insufficient evidence to support the U.S. claim, and therefore they will not sanction military action. The Bush administration will then undertake what is ostensibly is unilateral action, although they will get a few people, a few nations to join in, most notably Britain and Spain. A lot of the smaller countries will do it as well, because the United States will pay for it. They'll foot the bill. What we have to remember as the background of this, that we talked about in the 90s, is that in 98, the U.S. Congress passes a little bill, a little law, called the Iraq Liberation Act, which calls for the overthrow of the Ba'athist government. So all of this discussion of weapons of mass destruction, the connection between Hussein and al-Qaeda, all of this is a smokescreen. From the moment the Bush administration entered office, it wanted to topple the government in Iraq, and it needed an excuse. This provided what the Bush administration believed was an ample excuse. And so the final argument they're going to make, and the one that finally convinces Congress and the American people, is that the United States is going to undertake an effort in nation building and create in the Middle East the first stable Arab democracy. Okay? And that's why it becomes Iraqi freedom. All right. That's enough on that. We won't go into too tangentially into that. Now, the invasion and its aftermath, the invasion is really nothing to write home about. This is probably, most of you were too young to have sat and watched it on your television. I sat and watched it like the rest of the American people on the television. It lasted from 19 March through 1 May, and at the end of that, the Bush administration very famously and somewhat comically was standing on board the U.S. warship and said, with a big sign behind him saying, "Mission accomplished," as though it were all over. And of course, immediately upon the mission being accomplished, and I could go on with this for hours, but I won't. As the instant the mission was accomplished, the insurgency began. And one of the things that took place is, as the United States geared up for the operation in January and February, and really in December of 2002, what the Iraqis were busy doing was stockpiling arms for the post-invasion insurgency that was going to ensue. And then we get into very, very briefly, and this is kind of it. There's not enough incidents for it to really constitute a trend, although the United States has done it repeatedly, and it's something we cover at some length in American foreign policy, is this idea of nation building, the idea that the United States will go in and, following a certain model, will create a stable democracy with a Western-style liberal democracy. The first attempt at this was in Vietnam in the 1960s, and it failed miserably. They will attempt to do it both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, the first part of nation building is the destruction of the Ancien regime, to purge it entirely from the political ranks. Okay, they'll do this in Afghanistan by trying to excommunicate the Taliban, which they are unsuccessful at. Mullah Omar, who was the head of the Taliban, exists to this day somewhere in northern Pakistan, and the Taliban is still a very viable force in Afghanistan. The same thing will happen in Iraq, and in fact, it was just this last week they popped another of Saddam's inner circle. Finally, after 12 years, they finally found the guy. But this was what they did this time, was they associated. They had 52 of them, and each of them was given a playing card to represent them, as though it was a very confusing thing. I have no idea why they did that. But they went and hunted down the Ancien regime. They found, somewhat famously and somewhat tragically, they found Saddam Hussein actually in Tikrit. Saddam Hussein was a Tikriti. That was his tribe. And they found him in a hole in southern Tikrit after weeks of looking for him. Again, as the United States did in Afghanistan, and as is part and parcel with nation building, the United States exerted the same kind of electoral control in Iraq as they had in Afghanistan after the fall of the Ba'athist government. And it took about 6 months to arrange this, and then a little better than a year to finally get a government in place. And the United States, again, as it had in Afghanistan, was very careful to vet all the candidates. Anyone who was even remotely associated with the Ba'athist government was prohibited from election. Anyone deemed by the United States to be even tangentially in support of what the United States deemed to be terrorist activity was not permitted. And so again, what you create is this massive disenfranchised population who feel themselves not part of the political process. And this fuels the insurgency. And it was maybe, it has to have been 6 months or so into the insurgency that I can remember Vice President Dick Cheney on one of those news programs talking about how, in the estimation of the administration, The insurgency was going to be short-lived. It wasn't very popular. It was in fact on its last legs. And this would have been at the beginning of 2004. Okay, 11 years ago. And if anything, it's gotten stronger, not weaker. And this is because of something we cover in American foreign policy. I've mentioned it before here. One of the things that we study in American foreign policy, and one of the trends that we see, and we've seen it here in U.S. history, we haven't highlighted an awful lot, but we've seen it, is there is a kind of a tendency in the formulation and implementation of American foreign policy to believe what you want to believe. And so the United States believed that the Saddam Hussein government and the Ba'athist government was very unpopular, and that when the United States went in to overthrow them, that the Iraqi people would rally to the support of the United States, and they would greet the United States as liberators. In fact, exactly the opposite happened. They were greeted as conquerors. All right? And so that's been one of the things that has fueled the insurgency. And we'll deal with the Obama administration with his continued dealing with this insurgency. Now, the Bush foreign policy after 9/11, Bush rather famously and tragically declared war on terrorism. This is a problematic thing. And one of the things that we look at in international relations a little bit more is the idea that anytime you have a group of people that believe themselves to be politically disenfranchised, whether or not they actually are politically disenfranchised doesn't matter. If they believe themselves to be politically disenfranchised, you're going to have some of them that go to extreme measures, okay, to advocate their political position, meaning violence. And so terrorism has existed for 5,000 years because there's no system, no political system that under which all of the people feel politically enfranchised. And so you're always going to have some form of terrorism. All right? In the United States, there's been forms of terrorism. Okay, we won't go into them. We didn't get into them at any great length. We have so many fish to fry in this class, so we've let them go. But there are, Waco, Texas, Ruby Ridge, the Branch Davidian compound. Okay, all of these guys are people who would at least loosely be referred to as terrorist organizations because they don't forswear violence, and they've used violence to push political ends because they feel themselves politically disenfranchised. Well, part and parcel with this war on terrorism, the Bush administration creates this axiom, this catchphrase of the axis of evil. Okay, and who he lumps into the axis of evil actually is really Al-Qaeda, Iran, North Korea, and at that point, really even Libya. Okay? Pretty much anyone who opposed U.S. interests was lumped into this axis of evil. Now, in terms of North Korea, the Bush administration will recommence discussions at a multilateral level. It will be Bush's initiative to create multilateral talks, okay, including 6 nations, with North Korea over the North Korean development of their nuclear program. Now, North Korea was not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so they never signed a treaty that said they wouldn't develop nuclear weapons. There has been since the 1950s, which we talked about, there has been tension between North Korea and South Korea, and that is ongoing. So North Korea has, in an attempt to neutralize the overwhelming preponderance of force of the United States, undertaken to develop nuclear weapons. Okay, now let's back up a piece. And I didn't talk about this because we had too much to do with the Clinton administration, but negotiations over this program really began under Clinton, and a deal is struck. The deal is struck in 96. And what the basic tenets of the deal are, since the 1950s, since the Korean conflict, the United States has had in place sanctions against North Korea, economic sanctions. They have increased those. During the 90s, as the North Koreans began the development of their nuclear program, the United States increased these. Among other things, freezing North Korean assets in foreign banks, refusing to have dealings with banks that had dealings with North Korea, etc. There was a fuel embargo, etc. Okay, ever increasing economic sanctions. Well, the deal was the Clinton administration agreed that if the North Koreans allowed the IAEA, who I've mentioned before, into North Korea, and if they agreed to discontinue their nuclear program, the Clinton administration would ease these sanctions, eventually doing away with them altogether. Okay? Well, sure enough, the North Koreans allowed the IAEA in. The first IAEA inspections were in 97. Okay? In 98, they disassembled parts of their nuclear program. Their program was specifically designed for the development of nuclear weapons. They made no neverminds about that. Nuclear technology, nuclear fuel as well, but nuclear weapons. So they disassembled parts of this. But by 99, it became clear that the Clinton administration was going to renege on its deal. The Clinton administration had done absolutely nothing whatsoever to ease any sanctions against North Korea. So in 2000, the North Koreans began developing their nuclear program again. The Bush administration now comes into office, goes up in arms and says, oh, we've got to do something about this, starts the multilateral talks, goes over and offers the North Koreans the same deal. Discontinue your development of nuclear weapons, will ease sanctions. The North Koreans follow suit. This is now in 2004. Okay, between 2002 and 2004, these negotiations go on. The North Koreans agree again. The IAEA is allowed in again. The North Koreans demonstrate. The IAEA comes back with the report that the North Koreans have demonstrated that they've disassembled parts of their program to develop nuclear weapons. Once again, the Bush administration, really by 2006, it's very clear that the Bush administration has no intention whatsoever of removing any sanctions or easing them in any way. And so, as a result of this, the North Koreans begin the development of their nuclear weapons again. They successfully test a nuclear device for the first time in late 2006. In 2008, they have their first successful test of a medium-range ballistic missile. And so, that's where that stands. And on both cases, we have both the Clinton and Bush administrations, one Democrat, one Republican, doesn't matter, both of them reneging on the deal. Okay? And we get to a very serious problem here. Okay? Because in all, over history, if we look at it really from the 1980s onwards, okay, the last part of our class, the United States has threatened military force against 4 nations as a result of 4 nations allegedly developing nuclear weapons. North Korea is one of them. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, is another. The Islamic Republic of Iran is another. And Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, is another. Okay? Of those 4, 2 of them actually agreed to and then abided by the agreement to discontinue their nuclear programs, Iraq and Libya. And in both of those cases, the United States used military force to overthrow the government and implant what they hoped would be a pro-U.S. government. And so North Korea and Iran have expressed a certain reluctance to give up their nuclear programs. Because so far, the track record is that nations who are threatened by the United States, if they don't give up their nuclear programs, once they do give up their nuclear programs, get invaded by the United States. Okay. Iran, this is, and this is Bush. We'll talk about it again with Obama. We have the development of nuclear technology really beginning in the 1990s. The Bush administration becomes aware of this. And there is considerable, really from the middle of the Bush administration until current times, there has been an increasing amount of pressure brought to bear on, I suppose I should say, U.S. administrations, both Bush and Obama, to use military force against Iran. Okay? Now, under Ahmadinejad, who was the former president of Iran, who was voted out of office beginning of last year, there were no negotiations. He fundamentally refused to negotiate on the nuclear program. And it's not our intention here, and it's well beyond our scope to discuss the political system of Iran. But the supreme executive authority in Iran is not the president. Okay? He's the chief executive and officially head of state, but he's not the chief executive authority. The chief executive authority is the supreme leader, currently a guy by the name of Ali Khamenei. And so Ahmadinejad, the president, now Rouhani, is allowed to handle the day-to-day affairs and takes the spearheading. Rouhani is currently spearheading, or at least his foreign minister is currently spearheading, the negotiations over their nuclear program, but ultimately the decision is made by the supreme leader. Okay? So when we say Ahmadinejad did no negotiations, that directive came from the supreme leader. If the supreme leader had said negotiate on it, he would have had to. Okay? All right. Now we kind of segue a little bit, anyways, into domestic policies of the Bush administration. And we have the very controversial Patriot Act. And it's not my intention here. I'm not going to go through. We have more than enough to do. And after all, this is our last lecture, so we want to kind of lighten it up a little bit. We don't want this to be really the crescendo. We want this to be kind of a coda of fading away, really. So we're not going to go into the great details of the Patriot Act. Suffice to say that it was a vast increase in government latitude for investigation and prosecution that got the Bush administration in trouble for surveillance of American citizens beyond what's allowed under the Fourth Amendment, and prosecution. Okay, under the Patriot Act, there are a few different things. And I list them here. Warrantless surveillance is a violation of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. Okay, that's illegal search and seizure. Indefinite confinement. Okay, people that are suspected of either aiding and abetting terrorism or sympathetic towards terrorism or are themselves accused of terrorism can be held indefinitely, as witnessed by the folks in Guantanamo Bay. And then there are additional limitations under the First Amendment because it is a punishable offense to say anything in the mass media that in any way is deemed sympathetic towards Al-Qaeda or the terrorist cause. And so you have a curtailment of it. And when the Bush administration was pressed on this, he compared himself actually to Abraham Lincoln. Okay, and we didn't cover this. In U.S. History 1, we cover this, that Abraham Lincoln, in an effort to maintain support in the northern states during the Civil War, did away with any number of the amendments, most notably the Bill of Rights. He did away with the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the First Amendment, and the 10th Amendment as well. Okay. Also, the Sixth Amendment was curtailed under Lincoln, but that's tangential, right? We want to get down to business here. And so the Bush administration wanted to take the same actions for similar reasons. And like the Lincoln administration, none of this was endorsed by Congress. Okay. The Patriot Act was voted in by Congress, but there's some question as to their constitutional authority to do so, because really, if you want to go restricting the Fourth, Fifth, and First Amendment, that really requires additional constitutional amendments. The only thing that can curtail a constitutional amendment is another constitutional amendment. Okay, we had that with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. We had that in our discussion of prohibition with the Volstead Act. We had one amendment that prohibited the sale of liquor, and then another amendment that withdrew that. Because as it goes, there is a hierarchical ranking of law. Constitutional law is supreme, followed by statutory law, which are the laws selected by Congress. Okay, enacted by Congress, I guess I should say. The Patriot Act is a statutory law, not a constitutional law. When a statutory law is in violation of a constitutional law, the constitutional law wins out. This is what the Supreme Court does. This is the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Okay, this is the Supreme Court's capacity to interpret the Constitution. The Patriot Act has never been challenged, and it always reminds me. And it's really kind of funny because it came up under Obama just recently when Edward Snowden blew the whistle on the NSA and all the surveillance that they were doing and the warrantless wiretapping that was going on. And the Obama administration came under some hot water. There was a real bizarre public reaction to it because the American people, and I can remember one of my faculty colleagues saying it, that they don't really care if the American government is listening in on their cell phones because they're not doing anything wrong. And it always reminds me of a quote that I first heard attributed to Ben Franklin, but it goes back a little bit further, that any society that is willing to sacrifice liberty for security deserves neither, and will presently be denied both. Okay? Fact of the matter is that what we study in U.S. history, especially in U.S. History 1, is a group of individuals who sacrificed their lives to preserve our liberty. Okay, and so I tend to get myself up in arms with anything, however benign it may seem, that compromises that liberty. I may be doing absolutely nothing whatsoever wrong. That doesn't give you the right to listen in. Okay, and that gets me up on my soapbox a little bit, which I don't mean to do, but well, I guess actually I do, because among other things, if you look back through the history books, members of my family, which have been here from the early 17th century, fought in the Revolutionary War, and were members of the Sons of Liberty under Sam Adams, and so when it comes to that, I kind of get my dander up a little bit. All right. Now on to Obama's foreign policy. And here's where I could go off on significant tangents, and I shall do my best to rein myself in. We'll start with probably the most famous thing that's happened with Obama during his foreign policy. On the 2nd day of May 2011, a Navy SEAL team penetrates into Pakistan's border and assassinates Osama bin Laden, whose body is then taken out to sea and dumped, rather than given any kind of a burial. Okay? Now, the problem is, and this is, I can remember, it was Hillary Clinton, who's now announced her candidacy for presidency. It was Hillary Clinton that I can remember watching. She dressed down the Pakistani foreign minister because the president of Pakistan, about 6 months before Osama bin Laden was killed, and throughout from 2001 until 2011, repeatedly, insisted that the ISI, which is Pakistan's intelligence service, absolutely was 100% certain that Osama bin Laden was not in Pakistan. Okay? And so when the U.S. Navy SEALs team kills him in Pakistan, Hillary Clinton is like, what the hell's going on here? You guys assured us, and you're supposed to share intelligence with us. Okay, you're our ally. You're supposed to be sharing intelligence with us. You assured us that he was not here. Okay, so we were looking all over the place for him. Imagine our surprise to find him in Pakistan, living actually relatively comfortably. Okay, and so it strained tremendously relations between Pakistan and the United States, which had already started to come under strain because of the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. Okay, the United States, as I mentioned earlier under the Bush administration, the United States institutes, is I guess a good word for it, the Karzai government. Okay, well, the Karzai government is never actually really able to project force beyond a small area around Kabul. It breaks into a kind of what's sometimes referred to as a narco-mafia state in Afghanistan. The Taliban are very active. Okay, Al-Qaeda and members of Al-Qaeda are actively in Afghanistan. The Bush administration was under the assumption that Pakistan was working in coordination with the United States to stop this. And then really beginning towards the end of 2010 and through 11 and to current times, there come to be an increasing number of attacks on IASF, okay, the NATO forces, the coalition forces in Afghanistan, the convoys that are moving from Pakistan with material for them up into Afghanistan to support their position. There are an increasing number of attacks that take place on these things. Now, the problem is that the only way they can know when these convoys are moving, this is a military secret. Okay, somebody's leaking the information to the Taliban when these convoys are moving. Well, the only ones that have that information are the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service. And so there gets to be this growing suspicion that the ISI is working in coordination, at least with complicity with the Taliban. Okay? And that there are members of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda who have infiltrated the ISI and are feeding this information out. And so Pakistan becomes a less than reliable ally. Now, while that's going on, the Obama administration gears up and begins its withdrawal from Iraq. And in the withdrawal from Iraq, the U.S. Congress and Obama coordinate their actions and decide, okay, U.S. forces will leave Iraq in December of 2011, which in fact they do. There is this calm before the storm for the 6-month period leading up to December 2011, as all of the various insurgent groups mass their weaponry waiting for the withdrawal of U.S. troops. And sure enough, as soon as the U.S. troops are gone in December of 2011, the insurgency comes back virulently. Okay, it comes out, it goes up geometrically, culminating, of course, with the occupation of northern Iraq by the Islamic State forces. Okay, but that's not the only insurgent groups, and now you have Shia militias operating in the south under the command of Iran, who are in coordination with the Iraqi army fighting IS in various areas of Iraq, and so as a result, Iraq is degenerating rapidly towards a very anarchic environment, which is what's caused the Obama administration to kind of reinvest military personnel there, both in the terms of airstrikes and air assets, and also ground troops designed to advise and train the Iraqi army. Now, we also kind of simultaneously with this, we have the discussion of, well, okay, we've decided when we're going to withdraw from Iraq. What about Afghanistan? And the somewhat arbitrary decision is made to withdraw U.S. forces as of December 2014. Now, the problem with this is that all of the reports that are coming in from the United States military personnel on the ground, okay, McChrystal is the most famous of them. He lost his job over it because his report got leaked to Rolling Stone magazine and published in the United States, that the Afghan security forces are utterly and completely incapable of providing security. Okay? And so to withdraw NATO and U.S. forces at the end of 2014, you're leaving whatever government there is in Afghanistan effectively defenseless. Okay? And it will rapidly deteriorate into an anarchic state. What will form is coalitions of warlords, some of which are the Taliban. And so there's a real danger that the Taliban will reacquire their position in Afghanistan. Nonetheless, the Obama administration decides to go along with the deadline, despite all of the warnings from all of the U.S. military commanders on the ground there. All the warnings to the contrary, they decide, okay, we're gonna withdraw anyways. Then the Ghani government comes at the end of 2014 and says, whoa, we can't have you withdraw. We're not ready yet. And so the Obama administration, originally the Obama administration was planning on leaving about 5,000 personnel there as trainers and advisors, etc., not to engage in any kind of ground operations or any combat operations. Well, that number has now doubled. Okay, and Ghani was just in town. He was just in town in the United States. He was in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks back, wanting more military aid and humanitarian aid, and also arguing for more troops and a greater commitment by NATO and the United States. Okay, so the situation is spinning out of control. And that's kind of what we go over in this slide as well. A couple of other things that we look at. One of the more interesting things that has been a development really since 2010 are what they refer to as green on blue attacks. Green being the Afghan security forces, blue being the NATO forces dominated by the United States. By blue, what they really refer to, the blue is the color of the United Nations, so they call them United Nations forces, even though for the most part they're NATO forces and U.S. forces. But what has been noticed is an increasing pattern, okay, of attacks by Afghan security forces on IASF personnel, on coalition personnel. There are any number of reasons for this argument. One of them is that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are infiltrating the Afghan security forces. Probably a lot of truth in that. Another is that the Afghan security forces themselves do not support the Ghani government. Okay, this is this dominant trend that we see in American foreign policy and that we've talked about before and that I talked about previously in this lecture, that the U.S. believes what it wants to believe. It deceives itself into believing what it wants to believe. And the general tenor in the foreign policy apparatus of the United States is that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are an extremist minority, and they're not popular, and nobody really likes them, so there's not any popular support for them. Well, in point of fact, given the progression of the insurgency in Afghanistan, that doesn't quite ring true. Okay, they have a lot more popular support than the United States gives them credit. And so that's one of the other arguments behind this green on blue attacks. You see that there were 91 Afghan security, since from 2010 till last month, there have been 91 Afghan security force attacks on U.S. and NATO forces. Okay, they now comprise over 30% of all NATO U.S. casualties in Afghanistan are from Afghan security forces ambushing NATO forces, which is why the U.S. and then later NATO, both of them, suspended joint operations with Afghan security forces in September of 2012, because it was just as likely that coalition personnel were going to come under fire from behind as from in front. You know what I mean? In other words, from in front being from the Taliban and the insurgents they're fighting, from behind being the Afghan security forces they're supposed to be helping. It's just as likely the attack's going to come from behind, and so they discontinued joint operations. And from that point forward, it's deteriorated very rapidly. The other potentially difficult thing was a government transition. Okay, and the reason for this, again, this can become very tangential, but the Karzai government, as time went on, became progressively critical of the United States and the manner in which and the strategic approach the United States was adopting towards handling the Afghan insurgency. And as this criticism grew, there came to be tension between the Karzai government and U.S. administrations. It actually started under the Bush administration and continued under Obama. And so a transition was necessary. Okay? And so an election took place. The United States, again, very carefully controlled the election. And it was a runoff election between Abdullah Abdullah and a guy by the name of Ghani, and Ghani ultimately got the go. And again, the U.S. very carefully manipulated and controlled this electoral process, which again leaves you with a large number of Afghans who believe themselves to be politically disenfranchised and not represented by the government. And then you see that there's a proposed withdrawal from Afghanistan. We talked about that before. On to another of the Middle East-oriented foreign policy initiatives from the Obama administration. And this is kind of, I suppose I would say, the funniest of them. In January of 2011, beginning in Tunisia and Egypt, populist movements began demonstrations against what were ostensibly authoritarian governments, closed political systems, who were not. Now, the Mubarak government, for its part, was pro-U.S., but was authoritarian. Okay, they'd had, in Mubarak's entire time in office, he'd had 2 elections, both of which he only allowed one party to run, which was his party. He ran unopposed in the one, and the opposition in the other was a straw man who got less than 10% of the vote. In Tunisia, we had similar things. We have populist uprisings in Syria. We have populist uprisings in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia. We have populist uprisings throughout the region. Well, originally, the Obama administration jumps on the bandwagon and says these are populist uprisings against more or less closed political systems in the Middle East. And it's not that they're more or less closed political systems, but that they also are not particularly well disposed towards the United States or towards the U.S. regional ally of Israel. Okay? And so the Obama administration originally supports the Arab Spring movement. And among other things, probably the most notorious of them is supporting the overthrow of the authoritarian government of Mubarak, okay, and the support of the Syrian rebellion, which begins in the spring of 2011. Okay? All right. So that's kind of the original administration position. Now, rapidly developing, or the Obama administration, probably about a year into it, begins to realize that this populist movement, okay, is heavily influenced by Islamicism. Okay, there are radical members of the Islamic fundamentalist camp influencing this populist movement, and that these guys may not be well disposed towards U.S. interests. It really comes up in 2012 when the Freedom and Justice Party, which is the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, will, through popular elections, come to dominate the Egyptian political system. We'll look at that in just a minute. As I suggested, we'll look at that in just a minute. Here's Egypt, okay? Well, here's the problem. This is what happens, and I'll get to it as quickly as possible. Here's what happens. Mubarak, who is a U.S. ally, who is the second largest recipient of U.S. aid, is thrown out of power by a populist uprising. He resigns. The group that spearheads this, the political party, is the Freedom and Justice Party, which was illegal under Mubarak. Okay? Well, the United States presses them. Again, we see another episode of the United States deceiving itself into believing something. They press the Freedom and Justice Party to open up Egypt to an open political system with free and fair elections and a new constitution. Okay? Believing, of course, that the Freedom and Justice Party and the Muslim Brotherhood are a minority group in Egypt. They're this small collection, this fringe collection of radical Islamicists, and if you hold free and fair elections, they'll lose out. Well, in point of fact, they write a constitution. In the constitution, there are significant elements of Islamic law. The first one is thrown out by the Egyptian Supreme Court. They rewrite it. The Supreme Court has really no choice but to uphold it. They hold elections. The Freedom and Justice Party wins about 60% of the vote. Okay? Well, the Supreme Court throws this out. They hold new elections. The Freedom and Justice Party wins again. At this point, the United States is in trouble. Now, without getting into it at any rate, simultaneously, in the backdrop of this, we have a short, okay, this is 2012, November 2012, we have a short 13-day war between Hamas and Israel on the Gaza Strip. The United States cannot act as a mediator in this conflict because the United States does not have direct negotiations, direct relations with Hamas, because Hamas is a terrorist organization. Okay? And so into this comes Egypt, and they negotiate a settlement. The United States objects to this, To which Egypt says, well, if you object too strenuously to this, we want to remind you of something. We talked about this in class, the Camp David Accords, which is the only actual peace treaty between Israel and any of its Arab nations, any of its Arab neighbors. Well, in Egypt, this was never put to referendum. It was just simply enacted by Sadat, which cost Sadat his life. Okay? If the United States presses this too much, the threat is that we'll put this to public referendum. And if you put that Camp David Accords to public referendum, it'll be defeated. Okay? Well, shortly thereafter, the Freedom and Justice Party, the government dominated by the Freedom and Justice Party, is overthrown in a military coup led by General Sisi, the Egyptian chief of staff. Okay? And backed by the Obama administration, which put the Obama administration in significant difficulty. Okay? Because under U.S. law, the United States is forbidden from supporting any government, giving aid to any government that has been installed through a military coup. The installation of Sisi as president was the definition of a military coup. Okay, it was the textbook military coup. So this put the Obama administration in some difficulty. How the Obama administration dealt with it was absolutely brilliant. They just pretended it wasn't a military coup. They just simply pretended it didn't happen. It was complete denial. Okay, and so the United States immediately they at first suspended the sale of 4 F-16s to Egypt, and then they immediately recommenced it and gave Egypt $1.5 billion. Okay, with Syria, it was even more ominous for the Obama administration. Okay, so the Syrian rebellion begins. The Obama administration begins supporting the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian rebellion in general. Now, how they support them is through Qatar. Okay, the United States begins funneling arms into Qatar, and then from Qatar into Syria. Okay, the whole time claiming that this Free Syrian movement and this liberation movement is unarmed, they're civilians, and the Assad administration is ruthlessly slaughtering their civilian population. This later comes out that this is in fact not the case, that in fact the Syrian army is very well armed. They're armed, among other things, by the European Union and by the United States principally. Okay, well, about a year, if I recall correctly, it was about a year into the rebellion, the Obama administration starts to get intelligence of an ominous nature. The reason that the Syrian army is doing so well and this Free Syrian movement is not doing well is because a large portion of the arms that the United States is funneling to the liberation movement, to the rebels, as we would call them, okay, are actually not being used. What's happening to them is they're being stockpiled. Okay? At the meantime, the Obama administration is being fed intelligence very carefully, okay, and very, very deliberately that the Syrian government is using chemical weapons, is planning an attack on the Golan Heights against Israel, and so the Obama administration is being maneuvered into military intervention against Syria. And so what the groups are doing is they're stockpiling and massing arms for the post-Assad period. Very similar to what Iraq was doing. Okay, Iraq stockpiled all the arms, waiting for the United States invasion to end, and then the insurgency would use them. Same basic idea here. Well, one of those groups was a group known as Islamic State in the Levant and Syria. Okay, they later became known as just Islamic State. A lot of the arms that the United States funneled into Syria ended up in their hands, and they stockpiled them rather than using them. It was only beginning last year that they started to use them, and they came to occupy northern Syria and Iraq, and that's kind of the ironic twist here, is that the vast majority of the arms used by Islamic State to occupy northern Syria and northern Iraq were provided by the United States. Okay, which is kind of one of those bizarre things. We talked at some length about the Reagan administration and the myopia from the short-sightedness from which its foreign policy suffered. The Clinton administration, the same thing is true. We can go all the way back through our class and see that really after World War II, with the exception of Eisenhower, everyone was like this. Then you have Libya, okay, another case. Here, the situation spins out of control. The Gaddafi government, who's always been opposed to the state of Israel and therefore opposed to U.S. interests, at least in the eyes of the successive U.S. administrations, the situation is rapidly getting out of control. The United States begins to support with arms and equipment the rebels against Libya. The Gaddafi government begins to start to exercise control over the situation. The situation develops very much like what we now have in Syria. Okay, and so the United States goes to the United Nations, and we discussed this before a little bit. We discussed this idea of R2P, the right to protect. Okay, this is one of the arguments that comes out of the Clinton administration in the 90s and the redefining of the United Nations. This is one of those gray areas in the United Nations, the right to protect, because it's not actually in the charter. And the idea, again, to reiterate, is that if a government either cannot or will not protect the human rights of its citizens, it is the responsibility of the international community to so do. The United States goes to the United Nations with this argument. As a result of this argument, the United Nations endorses the use of military force to get rid of the Gaddafi government and protect the citizens of Libya. The United States will spearhead this operation with airstrikes. NATO will lead airstrikes against the Gaddafi government. That, coupled with the various militias and rebel groups, all of whom are receiving armaments from NATO and the United States, is enough to get rid of the Gaddafi government. This unleashes a series of forces, and we won't get into all of them. Among other things, some of these forces will end up down in Mali and will overthrow the government there. Okay? What we have principally is we have a very fluid situation. The Obama administration, as it has before and as previous administrations have done, deceives itself into believing that, as the Bush administration famously said in Iraq, that the mission is accomplished. Gaddafi's gone. Libya can now be turned over to an open, Western-style liberal democracy. We have another bastion of freedom and democracy in the Middle East. And so as a result, the Obama administration let down its guard. Well, on 10 September 2012, Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, warns, okay, in the sense that he doesn't really warn. What he does is he advocates, okay, he gives a directive to all operatives and all organizations in any way linked to Al-Qaeda to begin to attack U.S. assets, particularly diplomatic assets, okay? This is on 10 September. Well, on 11 September of 2012, the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi is attacked. The Obama administration had at least 36 hours notice that such an attack was going to take place and did absolutely nothing about it. And what pisses me off about it is that when it came out, the first thing Obama did was throw Hillary under the bus, deny any knowledge of it whatsoever. Says that the reports stopped with her. He never heard anything about it, which is absolute nonsense. Because for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the way the presidency works, every morning at between 6:30 and 7 o'clock, every morning of the presidency, every morning of Obama's presidency, the president meets with one person at that time, okay, and has a bagel, I suppose. And that person is the National Security Advisor. That's the first person every day to see the president and advise them on the situation globally. Okay, and the National Security Advisor, in no uncertain terms, warned the Obama administration of the danger in Libya, and Obama ignored it. And then when it blew up in his face, he threw Hillary under the bus. Okay, but that's enough. On to the foreign policy of the Obama administration in dealing with the geostrategic position, most notably Russia and China, as I mentioned, that with especially after Putin's commencement of his third term and the ascendancy of Xi Jinping in China, there's been much more interplay between the United States, Russia, and China. and a kind of a de facto alliance that's formed. And actually, it's not a de facto alliance between Russia and China. But what we want to watch with Putin, and actually just kind of, it's been actually kind of both tragic and kind of interesting to watch. Is to watch the Obama administration get outmaneuvered by Putin. The first incidents had to do with Syria, as I mentioned earlier in the discussion on the Syrian rebellion. The Obama administration begins to be fed intelligence regarding the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian army. Okay, which may or may not have been true. A lot of the use of chemical weapons wasn't the Syrian army, it was the rebels that used them. But that, neither here nor there. The Obama administration begins saber rattling. They are moving in the direction of direct U.S. military intervention in Syria. Okay, everybody's geared up for it. He starts to sell it to the American people. Okay, and after all, this is one of the last remaining erstwhile opponents of the state of Israel. So knocking them out would be in U.S. interests. Okay, and as the U.S. is saber rattling and goes to the United Nations with the same argument it went to the United Nations with under Libya. Okay, the right to protect. That look at the humanitarian crisis, blah, 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 that's being created here. And now we have evidence that Syria is in violation of international covenants regarding chemical weapons and the use thereof. We need the endorsement and sanctioning of the United Nations. We pass a series of economic sanctions against Syria. We need military force to get rid of the Assad government and move Syria along the lines of Iraq and Libya, blah, 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 blah. And so the Obama administration is in the midst of making this argument. Well, in the midst of this argument comes in Vladimir Putin. Now, as it works out, really from the 1960s onward, Syria and Russia have developed a very close working relationship. They have a treaty of friendship and cooperation. They had one under the Soviets. They renew that under Russia. And so Putin comes in and really within a 48-hour period diffuses the entire situation. He makes a deal with the Syrians that international inspectors will come in. Syria will give any and all information on their chemical weapons stockpiles to the international observation teams. These chemical stockpiles, weapon stockpiles, will then be removed from Syria and then disassembled. Okay, which starts to happen. This is now 2013, and it begins to happen. It diffuses the crisis immediately, and it leaves the Obama administration looking like a collection of warmongers that just want to use military force to essentially conquer the Middle East. Okay? Now, the second of them comes in the Crimean crisis, and this is an even more problematic one. Okay? This begins really in the spring, late winter of 2014, last year. Okay? A separatist group in the Crimea. What happens, how it starts, let me see if I can remember how it starts without getting into the background too much, okay? The Ukrainian president vetoes a bill that comes through the Ukrainian Congress, through the Ukrainian parliament. And what the bill wants is the bill wants to grant greater concessions to the European Union on Ukrainian natural gas. Now, mind you, the Ukrainian natural gas of which they speak is Ukrainian natural gas that's being provided by Russia. Okay? Under agreement, there's a pipeline that goes through the Ukraine. The Russians pump natural gas and oil through that pipeline. Okay? Ultimately to the European Union. Under agreement, the Ukrainians are allowed to siphon off a certain amount of that at a certain price. Okay, an agreement that the Ukrainians have broken on 2 occasions. As a result, they've had to suspend, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so it's a lengthy background. To cut to the chase, the Ukrainian parliament agrees to give them greater concessions. Okay? The Ukrainian president, who is more well-disposed towards Putin, says no. He vetoes it, right? At which time a small group within the parliament coordinates with a small clique of military officers to drive the president from power. Okay? He goes into hiding. He runs, then he escapes down to the Crimea, and then ultimately into Russia. Okay, now as it works out, there are, under the Ukrainian constitution, a number of reasons for the removal of a president from power. 1, he dies. 2, he is elected out of office. 3, he resigns his post. 4, he is impeached by parliament. None of those 4 things happened. And so Putin comes out with the position that the acquisition of power by this clique of parliamentarians and military officers constitutes a coup. It was unconstitutional. A separatist movement rises up in Crimea. Okay, now as it works out, about 65% of the Crimea is Russian speaking. They are ethnically Russians. Okay, rises up in objection and wants to federate with the Russian Federation. Putin supports this, okay, and the Obama administration really doesn't know what to do. And the Obama administration really doesn't know what to do because it's one thing to beat the living daylights out of Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya. It's another thing altogether to go toe-to-toe in an armed struggle with Russia. And so the Obama administration really is paralyzed, not knowing what to do. And so about the only thing it can do is advocate some sanctions against Russia, which are utterly meaningless, and offer some sort of diplomatic outrage. Okay? What Putin offers is the idea of the right to protect, R2P, the same argument the United States made in Libya and tried to make in Syria for direct military intervention then. The Ukrainian government not only was not protecting the rights of Russian citizens in its territory, they actually were organizing squads of members within their security force, within their intelligence security force, to systematically execute them, get rid of them, destroy them. Okay? So Putin moves in with military force to the Crimea, and shortly thereafter, the Crimea votes to federate with Russia. Now, as it works out, historically, Crimea has been part of the Russian Federation. It was after the collapse of the Soviet Union that Crimea was ceded over to the Ukraine in a deal that got the Black Sea Fleet divided, okay, of the Soviet Union. We won't get into that, okay, already too much, right? But at any rate, okay, so that's the second. Now, the ongoing crisis that's taking place in the eastern Ukraine is another of these episodes, okay? Again, a separatist movement rises up in the eastern Ukraine because the Ukrainian government is systematically violating both the human rights and the rights under the Ukrainian constitution of Russian citizens living in the eastern Ukraine, okay, in the Donetsk region. Putin begins to support, at least diplomatically and probably militarily, with the provision of arms, a separatist movement which still exists. They're now under a condition of ceasefire. The Obama administration, of course, goes up in arms, starts saber rattling, gets NATO to saber rattle. They increase the number of flights over the Ukrainian and Baltic states and into the Baltic Sea, and so some saber rattling goes on. They pass some sanctions which have absolutely no effect on Russia, and that's kind of where the situation exists to this day. And just recently, this was a week and a half ago. Actually, it was just this last week. Now that I remember, that 300 U.S. paratroopers arrived in the Ukraine to help train Ukrainian forces, continuing the fight in eastern Ukraine. And so again, what we have here is we have both these operative things, and if this were international relations, we'd talk about it at greater length. We have both of these things. We have the right to protect, R2P, which is a very soft law under the United Nations, and there's no real clear definition of it, and we have popular sovereignty. As it works out, 65% of the people living in the Ukraine, or in Crimea, are Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic. And so should they not then be allowed to carve out their geographic territory and decide their own government? The same argument is being made by Putin in the eastern Ukraine. The area affected by the rebellion in eastern Ukraine is about 70% Russian-speaking. And so again, we have this difficulty with popular sovereignty. And that's why we have this disconnect between the Obama administration and the Clinton administration in terms of the U.S. pursuit of foreign policy. The Clinton administration supports popular sovereignty, which is why the U.S. will directly intervene and become militarily involved in the Balkans crisis in the 90s. But now the Obama administration doesn't support popular sovereignty. And so we have this selective support for these things that creates this kind of contradiction in U.S. foreign policy. Developments with China that have taken place, we have the ascendancy of Xi Jinping as president of China. Really, in December of 2012, the Central Committee votes him in. He gets rubber stamped by the National People's Congress in January of 13. And we all kind of sat back, all of us who studied China kind of sat back and wondered what Xi was going to be like. Well, what he's like is he's adopted a much more aggressive foreign policy. Okay, the first real indications of this is that he's going to announce the creation of an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. He gets into which is still ongoing, a kind of a territorial dispute with Japan over 3 utterly meaningless islands in the East China Sea, known as the Diaoyu Islands. Okay, well, as it works out, surrounding those islands is one of the richest natural gas deposits in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, China now claims this territory. Around that territory, in the air around that territory, he'll constitute an air defense identification zone, meaning that any aircraft that enter that zone have to identify themselves or risk being shot down by the Chinese Air Force. Okay, Obama's reaction is to test this immediately. He sends U.S. military forces, U.S. military aircraft, B-52 actually, into the air defense identification zone, and it doesn't identify itself, and it doesn't get shot down. So it's much ado about nothing. Okay, as this dispute over these meaningless islands, over this territory in the East China Sea continues, the Obama administration, for the first time in many years, undertakes joint naval operations with Japan to show its support for the Japanese position. Okay, off the coast of San Diego, these take place. Okay, this is early last year, late 13, early 14. This is actually in the very early spring of last year. Okay, well, in response, for the first time in history, in the Sea of Japan, Russia and China launch a similar joint naval exercise, okay, as a signal to the Obama administration, okay, that China is not going alone on this. Similarly, and more interestingly, and something that I don't have on the PowerPoint here, but around the same time, it actually begins in 2013, one of the old Soviet aircraft carriers, which is in the Black Sea, is set to be mothballed. Okay, they're deciding what to do with it. Well, they ultimately decide that they're just going to get rid of it, going to destroy it and melt it down for scrap metal. The Chinese come in and say, no, don't do that with us. We'll tow it over to China. Now, originally, oddly enough, what the Chinese intended on doing with it was turning it into a casino off the coast. Okay, but during the tow, as they brought it back, they decided, you know what, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually use it for what its express purposes. We'll use it to train Chinese pilots on landing and taking off from aircraft carriers and how aircraft carriers are used. They then later say, well, screw that. We'll do that, but we'll also just make it an operational aircraft carrier. So for the first time in history, the People's Republic of China has an operational aircraft carrier thanks to their ongoing alliance with Russia. Okay? Now, in the meantime, also, they got themselves in some trouble in 2013 because Chinese passports started to be printed with the picture of China and Chinese territory that included the entirety of the South China Sea. Well, the South China Sea is generally considered international waters. And under international law, and according to the United Nations, it's considered international waters. Under international law, a nation gets as its exclusive security zone 12 miles off its coast. Then it gets another 200 miles as part of its exclusive fishing zone. This is well beyond that for China. The Chinese claim this whole thing, and earlier this year, maybe 3 months ago, they got into kind of a contest with Vietnam over it because the Chinese built a man-made platform. It was actually a natural gas rig, about 25 miles off the coast of Vietnam in the South China Sea, and the Vietnamese military moved out to try to interfere with the construction of the thing. The Chinese military came out to warn them off, and that's kind of where it stands. And more recently, this is as of 2 weeks ago, last week, this week, the Chinese moved assets down to the southern part of the South China Sea at the Spratly Islands, which lie to the southwest of the Philippines, and began dredging up the ocean floor and constructing man-made islands. There's a series of reefs in the Spratly Islands, so it's very low, very shallow water. They began building man-made islands, and just recently there were allegations, and these allegations have now proven to be true. This was as of 2 days ago, that satellite photography saw the Chinese building airstrips in the Spratly Islands. Well, once again, as with all of these, the Obama administration's response has been extremely reserved. Okay? It's been some diplomatic outrage, it's been some condemnation of doing it, but in point of fact, they haven't really done very much of anything. Okay. And finally, on foreign policy, we have Iran. And again, this is ongoing. The agreement is due to be signed or finalized by the end of June of this year. We have the transition from Ahmadinejad to Rouhani. And again, we're not going to get into Iranian politics, but Rouhani, undoubtedly under the direction of the supreme leader of Khamenei, immediately commences negotiations, direct talks with the Obama administration. This is the first direct talks that the United States has had with Iran in 30 years. Okay? The Obama administration claims this as a great coup, but in point of fact, it was the Rouhani administration that initiated it. And through the discussion of it, the basic idea is Iran will agree to allow International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors into Iran to inspect the Iranian development of nuclear technology. Now, Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and under the conditions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a signatory is permitted to develop nuclear technology for power, but not permitted to develop nuclear technology for weapons. Okay, and the claims were that Iran is using centrifuges to enrich uranium to create weapons-grade uranium. Okay, and there was this, and this has gone on since the diplomatic crisis has gone on really since 2006. Okay, under the Bush administration, and we talked about it under the Bush administration. Okay, well, in the ongoing discussion of this, a kind of an agreement has been made that in exchange for the Iranians allowing the IAEA in there to inspect things, and the removal of a lot of the centrifuges, and an agreement not to enrich uranium beyond a certain level, the United States, which began to impose sanctions on Iran back in 1979 and has increased them during this diplomatic crisis, will begin to ease those sanctions. Okay? They made an original agreement late last year to this, and the response was that the U.S. Congress voted in new sanctions. Okay? Because Iran's stated foreign policy position is in support of the destruction of the state of Israel. Okay? So if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, their target would not be the United States, it would be Israel. Okay? And that's why the Israelis have pressed from the beginning, from back in 2006, for military action to take out Iran's nuclear capabilities, and preferably military action to take out the Islamic Republic. And they've been pressing and pressing, and this is why there's been so much tension recently between the Obama government and the Netanyahu government in Israel. Okay? Well, recently, Kerry, Secretary of State under Obama, agreed in principle, this is the end of last month, agreed in principle to this agreement that in exchange for Iran giving up parts of its nuclear program, the U.S. will ease sanctions. In response to that, the Obama administration, Obama himself, made a deal with Congress. Now, we know, if we've been paying attention to anything at all, that Obama and Congress do not negotiate. They don't make deals on anything. There's no compromise on either end. Okay? Well, they made a compromise here. Surprise, surprise. That any nuclear deal that was made with Iran would have to go through the U.S. Congress. Now, the reason for this is because the U.S. Congress gets a large portion of its money from the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. And so essentially, by making this agreement, any deal that's finalized at the end of June is dead in the water in the United States. There's no possibility whatsoever of the U.S. lifting sanctions. Okay? Because Congress won't allow it. Congress won't allow it because of the very powerful lobbying efforts of AIPAC. Okay? Now, meanwhile, the remainder of the world community will. And in point of fact, this was the announcement that most recently pissed off the Obama administration. This was 2 weeks ago. That this would be the first week of April of 2015. The Putin administration, which has been very active in the negotiations with Iran, agreed to deliver to Iran an upgraded version of a surface-to-air missile system known as the SA-300s as a sign of good faith for Iran disassembling a lot of its centrifuges, which it did last month, over the last 2 months, actually, and discontinuing the enrichment of uranium. Okay, so the remainder of the world community is going along with this agreement step by step. The United States is not. Okay. On to domestic policy, first with Bush and then with Obama. And as I said earlier, and as we'll see, there really isn't an awful lot of difference between them. What we're going to see is a continuation of Keynesianism. The one unique feature, Bush is going to come in 2001, and the economy rapidly, for a variety of reasons that we don't need to go into, goes into a recession in 2001. It's the first recession in 10 years. And what Bush is going to do to try to correct for this recession is straight Keynesianism. Okay? The only wrinkle is the first thing he's going to do is when Clinton leaves office after 2000, he has a government surplus. Money in is actually greater than money out. And so what the Bush administration is going to do with that is give all U.S. taxpayers $600. He'll do it again later on and give all U.S. taxpayers $300. I can remember getting the checks myself. The problem is that now this is from stuff that we've already looked at. We've already studied about it. We don't need to get into the technical economics of it. What we've seen before. If you put more money in people's pocket, they'll spend more. This will stimulate the economy. Simple enough. Demand will go up, and therefore supply will go up, and therefore the demand for labor will go up, and therefore wages will go up, and therefore income will go up, and therefore people will spend more, and you get into this growth cycle that we've talked about before. To some degree, it's going to happen. It's going to help get the economy out of the recession in 2001. The problem is it doesn't have as much of an impact as most of Bush's economic advisors suggested it would. And the reason is because what people do with the money is instead of buying things, they pay down old debt. Okay, we talked with the Clinton administration. One of the things I'm preparing right now is a lecture on quantitative easement and consumer debt in America and all those different things. Not for you guys. You don't have to worry about that. Our semester's almost over. It's for a class on graduate economics. But what we're dealing with is the idea that under the Clinton administration, consumer debt, private household debt, just went through the roof. It actually, in 95, got to over 100% of the gross domestic of the money supply for the first time. Okay, so everybody's going into debt, and so what they did with this incentive, okay, what Bush did with the surplus, these checks that the Bush administration gave them was pay off old debt. So it didn't have as much of an effect to stimulate the economy. It's straight Keynesianism. What we have under the Bush administration is a 70% increase in spending and a 25% increase in revenue. It will become, prior to the Obama administration, the largest peacetime deficit in history. Okay, it will rise $5,800 billion under Bush. And we'll see what it does with Obama in just a minute. The famous thing that the Bush administration is going to do is institute a series of tax cuts, most notable of which are two. The Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001. And again, this is straight Keynesianism. Take a look at it. Okay, these are what become known as the Bush tax cuts. These will be extended by Obama in 2011. It decreases tax rates across the board, including the highest tax rate, which had been increased under Clinton. It decreases the capital gains tax, which again had been increased under Clinton. It increases child credits, and it gives additional benefits for couples that are married filing jointly. That's actually, in terms of taxes, that's the best position you can be in. You'll have the most exemptions, most deductions, and fewest tax penalties. He'll follow this up with the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003, which will just be some additional tax cuts. It will be also extended by the Obama administration. It was due to expire in 2010, and the Obama administration will extend it. And as I've said, and the point I'm kind of stressing, is that there really isn't a spit of difference between the Bush administration's fiscal policy and the Obama administration's fiscal policy. They are both strong Keynesians. The only real difference is that actually the Obama administration has accumulated more debt in a shorter period of time. But, okay. Now hits the banking crisis of 2008, which has been talked about way too much. We'll just go over it briefly here. I won't trouble you with the hardcore economics. A lot of it has to do with what we talked about in the Clinton administration. For a period of 15 years, Americans had gone progressively into debt. Okay? In 99, what we talked about with Clinton, they repeal the Glass-Steagall Act. That allows commercial banks to invest. And so investments are everywhere. Okay? Banks are lending out money. Banks are investing. A lot of what they're investing in are very risky investments. And they really began this at the end of the Obama, really with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, this began. What they refer to as suboptimal lending. Okay? Somebody comes into the bank with a crap credit rating. The bank lends them money nonetheless at a higher interest rate, which never makes any sense to me. Okay? You're talking about someone who has demonstrated an inability to pay off a loan at a low interest rate, 5 or 6%. By what stretch of the imagination do you believe they'll be able to pay off a loan if you crank the interest rate to 13%? Okay? This doesn't make any sense. And then what's going to happen is what's called derivatives. People are going to start selling off bad debt. An entire industry develops after the repeal of Glass-Steagall based on this. An entire industry of buying bad debt. I did it myself with my wife. Okay, my wife, when I married my wife owed about $8,000 in credit card debt. That debt was old enough that it had been sold to corporations that buy derivative debt. Okay? And so we started getting letters to settle up with these guys. I called them on the phone, and the way that these guys work, they buy the debt. This is how this works. They buy that debt for about 5 to 10 cents on the dollar. Because the people who issued the loan have written it off the books. Okay? So they'll buy that debt, $8,000, for $1,000. Okay? They then come after us. And I called the guy on the phone. I said, I'll tell you what. It says on your books she owes $8,000. I'll give you $1,500 and I'll never hear from you again. How's that sound? We negotiated it up. I finally paid him off at $2,200. Okay? That's how that works. That's why a lot of that money never goes back to the bank. Okay, well, this had been going on for a good 10 years. And finally, we have these financial institutions that are so enormous. We've seen this before. This happened, when did we first see it? We saw it, we talked about it in the Panic of 1893. One that I didn't talk about, 1907, the Great Depression. Okay, this is going to create the Great Recession. Very similar causes. You have overborrowing, overlending, okay, and eventually it reaches the point where they can no longer finance their debt. And when that point is reached, they start going belly up. Well, when they start going belly up and are unable to repay these financial institutions, you run a serious risk of your entire economy collapsing. Okay? Because these financial institutions are so large. This is where the idea of too big to fail comes. Okay, they're so large that if they go down, the ripple effect on your credit system will topple the entire economy. Not just the US economy, but economies throughout the world. Okay? And one of the arguments is that what we're seeing here with this 2008 crisis is 80 years of Keynesian economics. And remember what we've said, the point that I've stressed before. Keynes did not envision his model being used perpetually in an attempt to prevent a recession from happening. Okay? You cannot run a debt indefinitely. All right? But for reasons that we've talked about in previous lectures, the United States begins to do this. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is people wag their finger at all the American citizens who are deep in debt. Okay? Well, look at the example that the American citizens are given. They're given an example of a government that regularly runs, literally, $1 trillion debt. How are the American people expected to act fiscally responsible if the American government doesn't act fiscally responsible? Okay, so you have 80 years of debt, 80 years of running a consistent debt. And remember, the banking crisis of 2008 has nothing to do with the public debt. It has to do with private debt, private sector debt. Okay, we have 80 years of general debt. Okay, and in fact, that's what I've been working on the last few days is this lecture for the master's class. In the late 1970s, total private debt in the United States was about $75 billion. Currently, as of last month, it was $3.4 trillion. That's a pretty big increase. That's a pretty big, even as a percentage of the GDP, that's a huge increase. Okay? And so one of the things I remember from this, and really what we hold accountable for this, is a perpetual loose monetary policy, making lending too easy. Okay, interest rates held too low, etc. And Greenspan was, I can remember watching him address this. This was only a couple of years back. He addressed Congress, and he admitted to it. I've seen him admit it 3 times on 3 separate interviews. He admitted to it. He dramatically underestimated the greed of the banking sector. He didn't think the banking sector would do this, would give out all these risky loans, and would engage in predatory lending practices. Okay? Predatory lending practice? A predatory lending practice is loaning someone who makes 30 grand a year, $250,000 to buy a house, and then 2 years into it, when they can't make their payments, foreclosing on that house and then reselling it. That's a predatory lending practice. That's now illegal to do. Okay, that's now illegal for banks to do under the Dodd-Frank Act. Okay. Now, the aftermath of the, and that's one of those things, I'm patting myself on the back right now because that could have gone way more tangentially. I could have taught an entire course on that, okay? But at any rate, this is what becomes known as the Great Recession of 2008-2009. The first action is actually, now we're in the segue of Bush 43 and Obama. Now, Bush 43, it's not that Bush 43 became very unpopular because of the banking crisis. It's that the Bush 43 was prohibited from standing for another election because of the 22nd Amendment. Okay, he had served his 2 terms. To some degree, they had the aftermath of this Great Recession, the kick into the Great Recession. It's actually the Bush administration in the fall of 2008 that designs the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARRA, also known as ARIA, the American Recovery and Investment Act, which will be signed into law. It will be Obama's first action in February 2009 will be to sign this into law. Straight Keynesian economics. Grand total of $570 billion in increased spending, mostly for infrastructure development. $275 billion in new tax cuts for a total price tag of about $810 billion. Okay? Okay, continuing with domestic policy, we have what I referred to as Obama's Keynesianism, and as I've stressed a few times here, there really isn't that much of a difference between the Bush program of fiscal policy and the Obama program. As I mentioned ARIA or ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act with Bush. I may just as well as have mentioned it with Obama, and the same thing with this troubled or toxic asset relief program known as TARP. I could just as easily have mentioned that with Bush because it was really created in the cusp between Bush and Obama. It was a total cost of $450 billion. This is the famous bank bailout, and it should be. A couple of things are worth noting. First of all, it comes out of this idea of too big to fail, because the largest financial institutions were in trouble. They decided that if they did not replenish their liquidity, there could be no recovery. That may or may not be. That's not really my intention here to comment on that. But it should be noted that in the TARP program, which was essentially the government buying out what they referred to as the troubled assets or toxic assets, the non-performing loans and the non-performing derivative loans that had been undertaken by the banks and by other financial institutions. The government bought those up. That replenished bank liquidity. It should be noted that one, not all financial institutions took the money. For example, PNC Bank never took any money from the government because they weren't in trouble with it, because they hadn't really invested in toxic assets. And two, all the monies that were taken out were not only repaid, they were repaid to the government with interest. It should also be pointed out that the Obama administration actually has surpassed the Bush administration in terms of its kind of Keynesian approach to economics. Obama surpassed Bush both in defense spending, $700 billion a year as opposed to $500 billion a year, despite the fact that Bush initiated 2 conflicts in the Middle East. The Obama administration has continued those conflicts and expanded conflicts elsewhere, most recently in Yemen, with the civil war that has mounted up over the last month or so in Yemen. The Obama administration has become actively involved, not to mention the continued airstrikes in Pakistan and the air support against Islamic State and such, and a larger deficit increase. Bush accumulated $5,800 billion in 8 years, $5.8 trillion in debt over 8 years, as opposed to Obama, who has to date accumulated just a little bit over $7,000 billion, which is $7 trillion in 6 years. In addition, under the Obama administration, there was a resurrection of regulatory control over the financial sector with the what's known as the Dodd-Frank bill. It's actually referred to as the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010, signed into law by Obama. Mostly what this is going to do is this is going to try to correct for structural failures that led to the bank crisis of 2008. And you can see here what it is. A number of bureaucratic agencies are created to oversee the financial sector. The Financial Stability Oversight Council and Orderly Liquidation Authority, which monitors the performance of companies deemed too big to fail in order to prevent a widespread economic collapse. This is to prevent the too big to fail idea. The Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, which prevents predatory lending practices that we talked about earlier. The Volcker Rule, which limits the ways in which banks can invest and regulates trading in derivatives. And finally, the Office of Credit Ratings that has attempted to improve not so much household credit ratings that you and I know, but a more accurate system for assigning credit ratings to businesses at all levels. Then on to what has become the trademark of the Obama administration. This is probably going to be the legacy of the Obama administration when it eventually leaves office, is what's somewhat pejoratively referred to as Obamacare. It's actually called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and as I mentioned before, probably the least accurately named law in U.S. history, because there's not a single provision in the act anywhere that assures the affordability of healthcare. In fact, essentially what it is government mandated health insurance. At the time it was forged, there were 37 million Americans that had no health care. To date, there's still about 17 million that have no health care. I, in fact, was one of the ones that got caught in this net of Obamacare. Now, we won't go into the particulars of it. But it is the first, it is kind of the resurrection of, we talked about it with Clinton, that it's kind of the resurrection of this idea of healthcare reform. It is not, see, this is one, there are a few things, it is not socialized medicine. It is not government paid for medicine, okay? It simply stipulates that everyone has to have health insurance. And my beef with it is largely the beef that ultimately brought it before the Supreme Court, which is how can the government dictate to American citizens what they have to purchase? People don't see anything wrong with mandating the purchase of health care, and yet what if the government were to tell me that every week I had to buy 2 Big Macs? Then people would believe this is ludicrous. Well, it's largely the same thing, and what's happened so far out of Obamacare is that the insurance companies have begun to register absolutely record profits in excess of 50% in some cases. Now, it was passed among its many provisions. You can look up the provisions if you want to. Among it, it's a very long law. It's a law that's over almost 2,000 pages in length because of all of the earmarks that are put in there to get it passed. But they can't deny coverage for pre-existing conditions. They include children on a parent's on a parent's health insurance above the age of 25. Etc., etc. Now, the key that I want to focus on, though, is the passage of it in March of 2010, March 10, 2010. And the negotiations go on for the better part of a year. And there's a couple of things to note based on the passage of it. First of all, we note down here that the Democrats held a majority in the House, okay, 233 to 198. The Obama administration took great care in making sure this thing got passed before the 2010 midterm elections. Because if you look at the margin by which it passed 220 to 215. So it barely passed. It barely passed. If 3 votes had swung, it would have been defeated 217 to 218. So it barely passed, despite the fact that that the Democratic Party had a large majority in the House. And how it passed is actually rather interesting. This is really the time. Prior to this, in Obama's first administration, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, who never liked each other and who've always had difficulty working together, nonetheless were managing to get through. They got TARP through, they got Dodd-Frank through, and they got the ARA through, okay, the Recovery and Reinvestment Act. After this, it becomes virtually impossible for anything to pass. This is what's going to create gridlock, because during the negotiations and prior to the vote, Obama assured the Republicans that he would make sure the bill included things that would satisfy the Republican Party. Okay, he would compromise. But when he realized that he had a majority, he threw that out the window, and in fact began trying to pull on board, because he didn't actually even have the support for this bill of the Democratic Party, which is his party. And so to get more Democrats on board, he had to put in earmarks, okay, which are special interest provisions, to gain votes from Democratic senators and Democratic members of the House. And so the House finally passes it 220 to 215 by a very narrow margin, 3 votes. And The Senate passes at 60 to 39. Now, at the time, he had a 57 to 41, so only three of the contentious seats voted for it. And so it was not, despite what the administration attempted to present, it was not a particularly popular law, and it remains not a particularly popular law. And currently, the Republicans have a majority both in the House and the Senate, and they would very much like to, at the very least, gut the law, but they can't, because in order for them to do that, they would have to propose a bill that repeals parts of the law, and that bill could then be vetoed by Obama, and they don't have enough to override the veto. But if a Republican were to get in the White House, then they could pass a bill revising Obamacare, and rest assured a president would sign it and not veto it. And so this remains kind of an open issue, this whole Obamacare. The ACA, Obamacare, will be challenged in the Supreme Court, and it's actually rather interesting how the case is decided. This is in the summer of 2012. They challenge it on the basis of interstate commerce for reasons that I mentioned earlier. Okay, there are a few things that the government can mandate under the Constitution. Okay, they can mandate, for example, levying taxes and then buying defense spending with it. Okay, they can buy public goods. That's not what they're doing here. They're not buying a public good. This is not considered a public good. This is mandating what Americans have to buy. Under the Constitution, that's kind of a gray area. And so it's challenged on the basis of interstate commerce. However, it's upheld not on the basis of the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, but it's upheld on the basis of Congress's right to levy taxes. Now, the Obama administration, it should be noted, after Obamacare and the controversy that comes from Obamacare, the Obama administration is very quick, because some of its critics said, oh, well, what you have here is you simply have a tax. Okay, all you're doing is taxing Americans. And particularly you're taxing the Americans who can least afford taxation. And the Obama administration was saying, oh, no, this isn't a tax at all. There's no tax penalties, and, this has by no means, as long as Americans buy their health insurance, there will be no tax penalties, so it's not a tax. Well, the Supreme Court upheld the law on the basis of it being a tax. Okay? And so it constitutes a tax, and how it constitutes a tax, okay, and it's a bizarre type of tax, because, and one of the difficulties with the law, as someone who's subject to the law, okay, I didn't have health insurance prior to the passage of Obamacare. I was forced to get health insurance or suffer a penalty. Okay, so I'm one that actually got caught in this net. And as one who got caught in this net, the very people who this law was designed to help are the people that this law hurts the most. Okay, the Obamacare doesn't hurt the lowest class. Okay, if we divide, and I've mentioned this before in previous lectures, if we divide the income levels of the United States into four categories: the lowest income level, the second to lowest, third lowest, first quartile, second quartile, third quartile, and fourth quartile. Fourth quartile being the highest percentage of earners, the lowest quartile, the lowest percentage. The ones who this law hurts the most are that second quartile, okay, which would be roughly equivalent of the lower middle class, which are the people who had no health insurance. See, the lowest quartile, they had government paid for health insurance. They had Medicare or Medicaid. Okay, the highest echelon, they could either buy their own health care or buy whatever health insurance program they wanted. And then the upper middle class generally had jobs that were good enough to have employer-sponsored health care. So those weren't the ones who were uninsured. The ones who were uninsured were the lower middle class. And the reason the lower middle class was uninsured was because they couldn't afford insurance premiums. Okay? When Obamacare comes through, they still, speaking as a member of the lower middle class, we still can't afford health insurance. But now you're either going to face a $1,500 a year tax penalty, Okay, so it is a tax penalty, despite what Obama suggested. It is absolutely a tax penalty. Okay, that's what the Supreme Court decided. You're either going to face that or you're going to have to buy health insurance. And the real bitch of it is that the health insurance plan that I have right now doesn't really cover everything that's mandated in Obamacare. So I've got to pay $130 a month for health care. Okay, for health insurance, which effectively is $1,500 a year, and it's not entirely. It remains to be seen. Okay, the health guys that I go, the health insurance company that I got it from wasn't sure if it did. It remains to be seen. We'll find out next year what my accountant tells me, but it may not cover everything under Obamacare, so I might have to pay a little bit of a penalty anyways. Not a $1,500 penalty, but a little bit more of a penalty. And so all in all, this is why it's a tax. It means anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000 out of my pocket every year. Okay? And so it taxes the quartile that can least afford the tax. And so absolutely it's a tax increase. And now the controversies that the Obama administration has been involved in. The first one that we'll talk about is this famous government shutdown that happened at the end of 2013. Okay? This was a political ploy by the Obama administration to win back Congress in the House of Representatives in the 2014 elections. Now we want to be very careful with this and go through it. Okay, under the U.S. Constitution, the president, the executive branch, does not have the authority to levy taxes or to spend money. That is Congress's job. Okay, we talked about it in this class. It was under Theodore Roosevelt the first time when they created the presidential budget office, that the president would present Congress with his proposed budget. Prior to that, that didn't happen. Okay, now the president proposes a budget to Congress. It goes into the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee and Budget Committees, and they debate it. They discuss it. They send it back to the president with revisions. The president then, and a negotiation process goes on for anywhere from 3 to 4 months, and then eventually they vote it in. Okay, and every budget from Theodore Roosevelt onward, every single budget, with the exception of some of Franklin Roosevelt's budgets, has been a compromise. Well, in this case, the Obama administration presents the House with a budget. The House goes through it, revises it, sets up some compromises, and the Obama administration refuses not only to sign it, but refuses to even discuss the matter. He presents it to Congress as a fait accompli. You either sign this budget as is 100%, okay, or there will be no budget and the government will have to shut down. And then the Democratic Party, particularly the Obama administration, got its media spin doctors going to try to say that it was entirely the Republicans who were blocking things. Now, as it works out, John Boehner, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, attempted on numerous occasions to call the White House to talk to Obama on the matter. Obama did not call Boehner one time during the entire shutdown. Not one time did he call him. He never met with Boehner. He never negotiated it. What he was trying to do was two things. One, hold the Republican Party responsible for the government shutting down, which he hoped would garnish votes for the Democratic Party and win the Democratic Party back the House. And two, this created a constitutional precedent where it's no longer the case that Congress, despite the fact that under the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the authority to levy taxes and to spend money. This is going to change that. Now it's the president who will levy taxes, and it's the president who will spend money. And so he presents now to Congress the idea of a fait accompli, okay, that they will either sign it or there will be a government shutdown. Now the fact is the government shutdown didn't really last very long and didn't affect that many people. But for example, the Obama administration is trying it again. They tried it again this year. The budget that they presented to Congress was the largest budget in U.S. history. It was over $4 trillion, including over $1 trillion in new deficits. Okay? The idea being, and it's interesting that last year in 2014, the Obama administration did not do that. They presented a budget and negotiated it with the Republican-held Congress and got a budget passed. Well, that's because by the time the budget negotiations go on and get passed, you're beyond the 2014 elections. If you do it this year in 2015, the whole controversy and government shutdown will take place at the end of 2015 into early 2016, which is a presidential election year. And then if you're successful, you can stick the Republican Party, okay, with the blame for a government shutdown. So it's actually a relatively brilliant political tactic. It didn't work for the Obama administration. In fact, it backfired on them, and they actually gave up seats and lost ground in both the Senate and the House. But then we have the surveillance scandal. This was another brilliant maneuver by the Obama administration. And kind of to cut to the chase on it, this dealt with controversial wiretaps. Edward Snowden worked for the NSA, and he leaked reports to the press that the NSA and other government agencies were wiretapping not only suspected terrorist organizations, but they were wiretapping members of Congress. They were wiretapping allied states in Europe, among them Germany. They were wiretapping everyone. Well, the Obama administration rather brilliantly outmaneuvered Snowden and made the issue rapidly. If you remember watching anything, if you paid attention to the news at all, you watched this. Rapidly, the story started out with, oh my goodness, look at what the NSA is doing. They're doing all this surveillance on domestic institutions, etc., etc. And it rapidly spun to it being an issue of, rather than focusing on the Obama administration's violation of the Fourth Amendment and violation of U.S. law, instead the focus became, how could this Snowden guy leak state secrets? This was classified information that he leaked. You know, he's a criminal under U.S. law, and the guy had to take it on the lam and go over to Russia. Okay, a brilliant maneuver by the Obama administration to skirt responsibility for the fact that the Obama administration was in violation of the Fourth Amendment and was in violation actually even of the Patriot Act. Then you had Benghazi, which we talked about before. Again, the Obama administration had forewarning of the attack. Then we had the IRS scandal. Okay, it became known that the Internal Revenue Service was undertaking audits and investigating the tax liabilities of organizations that had given money to the Republican Party, and investigating Republicans themselves, Republicans in the Congress and the Senate, okay, but not Democrats. It was very targeted. When this came out, the Obama administration denied any knowledge of it, denied any responsibility of it, held the director of the IRS responsible for it, and it cost him his job. He actually had to resign. But we had another example of Obama skirting any responsibility for it. Okay, and basically throwing his underlings on the bus. In each of these, that's what we've seen. The Obama administration and Obama himself has thrown his underlings under the bus. Okay, the fact of the matter is that Harry S. Truman was right. The buck stops here. The president is the leader of the executive branch of government. If something goes wrong on the executive branch, he's like the captain of a ship. If something goes wrong on that ship, you're responsible. You can't throw your underlings under the bus. That's bad leadership. A good leader takes responsibility for everyone under their command. Okay, the Obama administration has never done that. In fact, every time there's a controversy with the Benghazi thing, he threw Hillary Clinton under the bus. With the IRS scandal, he sent the director of the IRS under the bus. The surveillance scandal, he sent the head of the NSA under the bus. Okay, and then finally we have the drone strikes, and that's just kind of the last thing I mention here. The controversy with that came up is there was no problem with using the unmanned aerial vehicles, the UAVs, the drones, to hit terrorist targets, to hit targets of Al Qaeda and the Taliban in northern Pakistan and in Afghanistan and even in Yemen. But what the Obama administration started to order was the use of drones to target U.S. citizens abroad who were suspected of complicity with terrorist organizations. Now, this is another of the breaches of the Constitution, particularly the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, because under U.S. law, someone who goes and supports what the United States government deems a terrorist organization, this is even under the Patriot Act, okay, which expands government power. Someone that does that is subject to U.S. law, which means they have to be arrested, prosecuted, they have to have a defending attorney on their side, they have to go through due process. To simply assassinate them with drones is a violation both of the U.S. Constitution and U.S. law. And so these are just some of the controversies that the Obama administration has gotten itself into. And it's too late, it's too early to tell the legacy of Obama, so we don't have a slide on the legacy of Obama. But effectively, that is the end of the final lecture. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was the longest lecture. I meant for that to be as short as possible, but a lot's happened in the last 15 years. So, all right, that's it.